they're going to arrest one of you, right? Anytime you call them out, probably, if there's been some sort of use of force, and they're not going to want to hear the whole backstory behind it. They don't care.
We're the Armed Attorneys. Today we're talking about the 5 most common self-defense scenarios we find folks get into, the major pitfalls associated with those scenarios, and why it's so important that you prepare in advance so you don't become a statistic. But before we begin, show your support for the Second Amendment by leaving a comment. We want to hear from you if you find this type of information helpful. Now, we analyzed several thousand critical incidents that we've been involved with over the years, and we discovered there's some reoccurring themes here with the most common self-defense scenarios. And why this is so important that we discuss, because, if you live on the coast, you want to prepare for hurricanes. If you live in a fault zone, you want to prepare for earthquakes. And when we see these scenarios pop up over and over and over again, I think it's a good indicator that these are scenarios that you need to be thinking about if you intend on carrying every day. Now that brings us to number 5, the 5th most common self-defense scenario we find folks get into. And what is that, Emily?
Yeah, that's breaking up a fight. Let's say you're just, out and about, going about your daily business. You see, one guy getting pummeled by another. You decide you're going to go help. Unfortunately, we see that go wrong quite a bit.
Yep. And I would say the common pitfalls we see associated with this are maybe it starts out as a use of force or physical force or, a low level of non-deadly force, and it escalates to a use of deadly force because, the person intervening doesn't know everything that's going on, maybe who the good guy is, or, if there's a crowd of people that multiple people are involved. And so we see these things escalate very frequently.
Yeah, and I mean the guy who is, frankly, either guy, either the good guy or the bad guy in this scenario, they're not going to distinguish between you and the other party when you're sort of in the fray. And so, that does require a lot of times an escalation of force on your part, potentially even to deadly force. And then, if you, especially if you don't know, and then all of a sudden you shot the good guy because the good guy's taking swings at you because he's just so disoriented, potentially you have a huge problem.
So just be cognizant that this scenario comes up so frequently that it's number 5 on our list, and that if you are going to involve yourself and intervene in defense of a third person, assuming it's legal in your state, you got to be very careful that you understand the circumstances that are taking place. And that brings us to number 4, and that's another type of fight, a bar fight or a restaurant fight. And what's like an example we see of this?
Oh my gosh, a lot of our cases stem from bar fights. Everyone's drinking, first of all, and so that's not a good way to start any story. But then, you're intoxicated, you're not really using perhaps the level of force even to defend yourself that you would normally use.
Right.
And proportionality is not judged based on the intoxicated reasonable person, right? It's going to be judged based on the ordinary and prudent man.
Yep.
So we have, I can think of 2 examples just off the top of my head. One, I had a client who, I think really was the victim of this bar fight, but he ends up at the bottom of sort of a dog pile, and he bites someone's nose essentially off. It was pretty gnarly, but that's the sort of thing you get arrested for. He's not even sure who he's biting. He's just using the most defense that he can. His hands and his feet are not free. And sure enough, he's arrested for a second-degree felony here in Texas because he's caused serious bodily injury. It's just it's tough to combat that when you are the guy who used the most amount of force, even if you're alleging I was the guy who was at the bottom of this pile.
Yeah, and we see this principle come up in lots of different defensive scenarios, but in this one, the element of innocence, when juries don't like is when people are perceived as heightening emotion or heightening tension or escalating the incident. And so we see that come up frequently in these kind of bar or restaurant disputes. And things that you can do to avoid this: don't become intoxicated. If you decide to go out and celebrate, be very cognizant of not escalating incidents, not provoking incidents, not, we see this come up over and over and over again, but it's one that can be easily avoided.
Oh, yeah. Don't let your pride take over when, ultimately that could mean a trip to jail and then the consequences going forward fighting a self-defense case.
Yeah. The number 3 most common self-defense scenario we find folks getting into is a neighbor dispute. Now, this comes up in a couple of different forms, I'd say. Neighbor who doesn't respect a boundary on property, or a neighbor who maybe has dogs that's destroying your property. We see this come up a lot. Destroying fences,
They're
tunneling
too
under
loud.
fences. Yes.
There are all sorts of things that come up between neighbors.
And where the major pitfalls are with neighbor disputes is that, let's say you're ever forced to defend yourself, use force, or you're forced to preserve your own life, use deadly force in that scenario. What police don't have a very good grasp of, and prosecutors and juries to that extent, they don't understand, and they won't, in many cases, be allowed to see the history, of what led up to this use of force or deadly force. They're going to look at that snapshot of what happened in this exact moment. And I think folks have a lot of trouble separating, hey, this person has been a nightmare for 5 years, and then it just finally boiled over. And whenever they review that person's actions, were they acting reasonable in this instance? They don't really get to see that whole entire lead up to it.
Yeah. Plus, Richard and I can tell you from having worked on the other side, from having worked on the law enforcement side of things, law enforcement officers hate responding to neighbor disputes.
Yeah.
When they do, they're going to arrest one of you, right? Anytime you call them out, probably, if there's been some sort of use of force, and they're not going to want to hear the whole backstory behind it. They don't care. Then, as prosecutors, how many neighbor disputes did you see?
A lot.
A ton. And then the problem as prosecutors is that neighbor, you've been arrested, that neighbor still hates your guts, assuming he's alive, still hates your guts. And so it's hard then for the prosecution to even resolve your case short of a trial or a really, really severe punishment via plea bargain, because they've got the neighbor down their throats because the neighbor hates you. You don't have a victim who's saying, oh, I don't really care what happened. It all got blown out of proportion. You've got somebody who's like, throw the book at him.
No, I had a complaining witness who every time his neighbor came home from work, that just reignited all the fire in his belly. And he called me and he said, complained, I feel strongly about this case. I want maximum punishment. So avoid neighbor disputes, those pitfalls. Act as a last resort. That's really what it comes down to for neighbor disputes. You really want to de-escalate, act as a last resort. And eventually, getting charged with a crime is very life disrupting. Avoid at all costs. Yeah. That brings us to number 2. What is that in?
Yeah, those are dog attacks. This happens so incredibly frequently. And again, I think we have something that's a little bit similar with our neighbor disputes, which is a lot of times people end up shooting when they're looking at sort of a past history with a particular animal, not what that dog is doing on that particular day. In fact, that happened to a good friend of mine. Her father did this exact thing. A dog had actually killed his small dogs several weeks prior. He saw the dog again. The dog was not doing anything aggressive, and so he shot it. And unfortunately, when police show up, they're not going to want to hear, that dog killed my dogs 2 weeks ago. They're going to say, what was that dog doing today? Why was it immediately necessary? Why did you have to defend today? And it's a huge problem for people. Also, just the notion that, well, it's on my property, that means I can shoot it, which is, not true in any state I know of, even though we like to think it is.
Yeah, and I see that come up with, especially if they kill chickens or something like that. Well, if the dog, every time it gets on the property, it kills one of your chickens, well, guess what's going to happen this time? You see it on your property. Well, it's probably going to kill your chicken. But law enforcement, prosecutors, juries even, they are, again, looking at that snapshot. So you got to be really careful. The other one that comes up is, let's say you go walking in your neighborhood with your animal, getting attacked by a dog, or seeing dogs on the loose, not behind fences, not on leashes. If you find yourself in that scenario, it's really important to maybe have alternatives to a firearm, because if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And if you find yourself in that situation of having to defend yourself or defend your animal, you want to maybe have some intermediate tools. Because I see that come up a lot. In my city, there's dogs roaming all over the place. And so you maybe think about carrying, assuming it's legal, a baton or a stick or a chemical spray or some alternative to a firearm if you find yourself in that scenario. Because I'll tell you, police, let's say you have a dog that's attacking you and you shoot it, completely justified. For whatever reason, just discharges within city limits, police officers are always looking for, hey, a gun went off. Maybe there's some other crime here. Maybe you're not getting charged with cruelty to an animal or something like that, but discharging across a roadway or discharging towards a vehicle or a habitation.
Towards
or,
a habitation. Exactly right.
So you got to be very, very careful. And that brings us to our number one most common self-defense scenario we see folks get in. And what is that in?
That's road rage. I would say road rage is probably 80 to 85% of all the calls that we get.
It's pretty high.
It's really high. Well, okay, how about all the arrests that are made?
That is 100% true.
And road rage is scary. And I think, I've read news reports right now that it's like road rage instances are increasing all over the country. We're all mad, right? And we tend to take it out on people on the road around us. Unfortunately, it is really, really tough once you have, even if you're the good guy, which by the way, both parties always think they're the good guy.
Right.
But even if you're the good guy and you're just trying to mind your own business and you're not even engaging in the road rage at all, and you're terrified and okay, this is, I feel like my last resort. I'm going to pull out my handgun. I'm just going to put it on my dashboard. I'm going to show him. You are the guy who is going to get arrested, right? It is just, these are he said, she said cases. As soon as you do that, the other guy is calling police. They're not reporting their bad driving. They're reporting a crazy driver who is just pointed. It doesn't matter what you do with the gun, by the way, you will have pointed it because that is always what they say. Yeah.
And so, what does this look like? You're getting on the highway, somebody won't let you in, you start getting brake checked, people start speeding up and slowing down. And what makes this, I think, happens so frequently is driving is what's called a divided attention task. You're paying attention to a lot of different things at a high rate of speed, and your brain only has so much capacity to handle things that are getting thrown at it. And then that kind of lowers the trigger for, I think, or ability to control emotions is basically what I have seen. Mm-hmm. I don't have any medical journals or studies to back that up, but we see this happen so frequently that's kind of the lay conclusion that we've come to. So it's really stinking important. If you carry every single day, you carry a firearm inside of your vehicle, if you find yourself in that scenario, to de-escalate and avoid like the plague. Most states allow someone to be charged based on the testimony of a single witness. So if that other driver says, hey, that person pointed a gun at you, you happen to have a firearm or handgun in your vehicle, the chances of you getting arrested are extremely high. So de-escalate. Don't engage in road rage. If you feel threatened, drive to a police station, exit the street, slow down, get away from the driver. But you don't want to be using force or threatening use of force or deadly force unless it's a last resort. If the person gets out of their vehicle and starts coming at you with a tire iron, or if they point a firearm at you or start shooting at you, obviously you got to preserve your own life, based on the law of self-defense in your state. But be very careful with these scenarios because it comes up so frequently.
Yeah. And that really, we can, fall back to another self-defense principle here, which is avoidance. Mm-hmm. Even if, and you're probably going to say, well, it's not fair. I'm the victim and I'm the guy who's got to try really hard to get away from this other guy. Yeah. I get it. But avoidance, that's going to be the question on the minds of the officers, the prosecutors, your jury potentially, is what you were in a thing where you could have just set your foot down and been gone. Yeah. Why didn't you use that machine you were in to get away somehow? It might not be a fair question, but I guarantee 100% of the time it's the question they're going to ask.
Yes, and even in those states that are stand your ground, you have no legal duty to retreat. You're not committing a crime, other than maybe you're having to defend yourself. You're in a place you're legally allowed to be, and you did not trick the person into fighting you. Even in those states where you have no legal duty to retreat, juries just can't help themselves. They're gonna think about it. But we hope you enjoyed this discussion. If you did, consider subscribing, hitting that like button, and this is huge. Help us fight that anti-2A algorithm by sharing this video.
And please continue to question and comment below. Until next time, we're the Armed Journeys.